And this is a little hard for me to talk about because there was an open letter to the Green Party. Some of the people associated with this letter are people whose work I admire dearly, people who have educated me most of my life, and people who I think I agree with about 99% of the time. And in this letter, that was the 1% of the time where I disagree with a lot of what was said. So there was an open letter to the Green Party that I know you've read, that I've read as well, kind of basically saying you guys should do a safe state strategy in 2020. And there were some points in that letter that I strongly disagreed with. I'd imagine you did too. And there were some points in there that I thought were, some interesting criticisms that could be looked at. But I thought that even those points were kind of overshadowed by the conclusions, which again, I strongly disagreed with. But let me get your thoughts on it first.
Yeah, I think we've sort of addressed this in the course of our discussion already. To me, these are very dangerous talking points. The notion that independent political parties should be silenced or suppressed. That is an authoritarian talking point. And in these times when we are seeing, McCarthyism all over the place, and the flip side of the warmongering, is political repression and censorship. And, they're coming after independent journalists and, Glenn Greenwald, Julian Assange, Max Blumenthal. These are really dangerous times. And I think this is not a time to be encouraging political repression. To my mind, anybody who's whining about those independent third parties who's not pushing ranked choice voting is just like really clueless and off base and not computing. And it seemed to me, although I could be wrong, but I think everybody on that list was over 60 years old. Is that part of it?
I'm not sure, but yeah.
Every name I recognized was it's the old guard. It's the old guard sort of expressing their old guard view of things. And it's just out of touch with the kind of desperation that people are feeling right now. That's not, and they totally mischaracterized our campaign in many ways. I never said that Clinton and Trump were the same. What I said in my specific, soundbite about that was that they are different. They're just not different enough to save your job, to save your life, or to save the planet. And that's true. And if it's Bernie against Trump, that's a very different matchup. And people are going to make up their own minds thoughtfully about that. And they're not going to take marching orders from a Green Party hierarchy about what to do. And I think that's really misguided of them to suggest we start telling voters what to do. And then the other point was that, we made the difference in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. That's absolutely false. And they're cherry picking the data here. First, they're discounting the impact of, if they're going to say my votes were taken from Hillary, which is a totally entitled, presumptuous thing to say. That's why Democrats lose votes, because they think they own them. That doesn't engender good feelings from voters to feel like, the Democrats think they own your vote. They have to earn your vote. And what they said just kind of reeked of that. And it supported that really crazy, abusive point of view. And they also, so they discounted the impact that Gary Johnson would have had on, if you assume my votes came from Hillary, then you assume Johnson's votes came from Trump. You add them up, guess what? Trump wins big time. So, they're just looking at one side of the equation and saying, we're just going to silence progressives here. And you shouldn't be silencing third parties at all. You should be fixing the system. And the last thing is that the numbers don't add up also, because there were two polls, I think one done by New York Times, ABC, or something like that, that showed, these were exit polls that showed that voters who voted Green in the presidential would not have come out. 60%, over 60% would not have come out to vote if they didn't have a Green to vote for. They weren't going to choose between these two candidates of war and Wall Street. So it's just not true. And then if you apply the numbers that were established by these exit polls, what it said, if you want to get into the weeds here, was that 11%, net 11% of my vote could have applied to Hillary. So if you apply the numbers, multiply 11% times my vote, it doesn't come anywhere near the Trump margin of victory in each of those three states. So the data is engineered and false. It's false. And they're just mimicking Democratic Party talking points. And I think that's really irresponsible.
And that was what bothered me the most in that too, because I mean, there was also, and we don't have to get into like all the specific verbiage, but there was basically something hinting that it was your job to campaign for her. And it's like, well, wait a second. Jill Stein was campaigning as Jill Stein. And if you want to single out these states, all right, let's do that. Wisconsin, she didn't bother showing up in at all. Michigan, she barely showed up in. That was a state Bernie was very popular in. She made no promises to the working class there. Pennsylvania, my home state, which hasn't gone red for a presidential since 1988. 2016 was the first time since 1988. She hung out in the city. She hung out in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, where she knew she was going to do well. Didn't bother going to the middle of the state. And let me tell you something about the middle of the state there. Let me tell you something about West Virginia. Those people, they remember NAFTA because they lost their job. They remember it big time. And all she could offer them was that she went around the country promoting fracking. And that ain't much of an offer. That ain't much of an offer. So, it was just unbelievable. It's like, well, Jill should have went harder on talking about those tips. I'm like, what do you... She was supposed to campaign for Hillary in the places Hillary didn't bother showing up in? Are you... What? How does that add up? All the resources the Clinton campaign had, it was Jill Stein's job to campaign for. That makes zero sense. That's not how elections work.
And the Democratic establishment has worked so hard to avoid any kind of an accounting, any kind of accountability, any kind of a, look back in order to do better in the future. They don't want to do that at all. And I think it's irresponsible of progressives to just buy into that. Let's sweep it all under the rug and let's support, a party that's basically a political front for Wall Street and the war machine. I think it's just a little politically clueless. So, I can't say I was terribly disappointed because I've learned over the years. When I was campaigning for governor of Massachusetts in 2002, all of the living Kennedys and Clintons came out in that race to say that a vote for Stein was a vote for Romney, who was my opponent in that race. And I just learned early on that this is what they do, and they take marching orders from the guys in charge. And it's just that's not. To my mind, that's not a show of integrity or strategy to just fall into that game. I think progressives should get beyond that.
Well, and to kind of bring it full circle here as we're wrapping up, I think like that letter could have easily been altered a little bit and just been a call for ranked choice voting, and we could be talking about how constructive it was, right? You know what I mean? Like it's like. Some of the interesting that they brought up, okay, if the DSA has grown in more popularity than the Greens, that's interesting to talk about. Let's talk about that. Why might that be? Like if the Greens aren't seeing as much locally as they want, well, I think that has a lot to do with the suppression of third parties. So it's time for ranked choice voting. Like let's get to that conclusion.
And let me just add that was another lie that they propagated, that Greens don't work locally. I mean, we are very focused on local elections and local candidates. We have a lot of them. We have a lot of people who serve and who have served locally. That's another talking point of the Wall Street machine to try to dismantle us. The Greens are the only surviving national non-court political party. All of the others are systematically feared campaigned and smear campaigned and and prosecuted and persecuted. Whether you're talking socialists way back or communists way back, the Working Families Party is absorbed into being basically an appendage of the Democratic Party. Not that they don't run some good candidates, but at the end of the day, they'll pull out all the stops for Cuomo, in New York State. The Peace and Freedom Party has been beaten back to, a handful of states. I don't know where they are besides California right now. The socialist alternative is beaten back, or I should say the socialists in general have been beaten back to small parties that run in cities. This is what happens to non-corporate political parties. Greens are the only survivors, so we have been under attack big time. We're smeared and sabotaged and, victims of all of that stuff, yet we are the only survivors. We were founded at the same time that the Labor Party was, and the Labor Party had infinitely more resources, people, establishment, institutions, and money. They were destroyed. Everybody is systematically destroyed if you go up against if you go up against the powers that be, City Hall, the politics of City Hall, you will be targeted. And, so it's, to my mind, the wonder is not that the Greens have been beaten back. The wonder is that Greens have been able to survive, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for being the only political party that has been able to survive while all the other non-corporate parties are destroyed around us. So, this is a propaganda campaign right now. And unfortunately, that letter played right into it, and they ought to know better.
Sure. And I mean, what I meant by that statement, though, was if you take away the fear factor, like the way you put it, like with ranked choice voting, you take away the fear factor. I think that would lead to more local victories by the Green Party and more Greens in city council, more Greens as mayors, more Greens as, I think it would lead to that.
Absolutely. And what I take issue with here is not the point you've made, but the point that letter makes, which is basically just propaganda, propagating propaganda, and that's totally not true. And you're absolutely right. The reasons that Greens have not done better at the local level is because we are, we're systematically, dismantled by the powers that be. And, these are the forces at play right now. And it's a kind of life and death struggle that we're all a part of. And it's really important, I think, not to be confused by the propaganda out there that is trying to push back against one of the only, and I should say the only, national scope political party that is fighting the corporate power.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and